Hello and welcome to Access Asia. I'm Yuka Royer. This week,
my fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day.
As Donald Trump appends the global trade order, we'll discuss what those sweeping new tariffs would mean for Asian economies and how they might reshape transnational supply chains. Living up to his self-proclaimed tariff man moniker, US President Donald Trump has made the most significant trade policy move so far in his presidency. He announced a 10% baseline tariff on all imports coming into the United States and imposed much higher rates on around 60 countries, which he claimed had been treating the US unfairly. Global stocks tumbled in the wake of the announcement, with Wall Street suffering the worst session since the early days of the COVID pandemic in 2020. Now, many of what President Trump labelled the worst offenders are in Asia, including close partners like Japan, South Korea and India. And some Southeast Asian nations are among the worst hit. France 24's Charlie James is here to break down the numbers and how those countries have been reacting. Hi, Charles.
Hi there, Yuka. Let's start with China, the #1 importer of goods in the entire world. During his announcement, Trump said, "I have great respect for China, but they were taking tremendous advantage of us." And he hit China with a 34% tariff on goods on top of an existing 20% tariff, bringing the total to at least 54% for Chinese imports. So Chinese officials immediately reacted to this. They called it unilateral bullying, and they have already announced reciprocal tariffs, their own 34% tariff on U.S. goods. So needless to say, the prospect of the world's two largest economies even further escalating their trade war, this is not something that investors and manufacturers are excited about. Next, let's look at the close U.S. Asian allies and partners of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Japanese politicians in particular, they were crossing their fingers, hoping that this close political and trade relationship that they have with the U.S. would spare them. But no such luck. Japan called its own 24% rate extremely regrettable and said it may violate existing World Trade Organization and U.S.-Japan agreements. Unlike China, though, Japan is saying nothing about reciprocal tariffs. That's because raising its own tariffs on U.S. imports would likely increase inflation in the country. This is something that has already been surging in Japan. So getting into a tariff war with the U.S. would be pretty self-defeating for the nation. Now, some viewers might be wondering, why would the U.S. impose these measures on its own allies, its own close partners? Well, Trump clearly, we know, sees tariffs as a negotiating tool. And so it's quite possible that he could be trying to strong-arm U.S. partners into opening their own markets up even more to U.S. goods and lessening the trade imbalance. You know Trump hates a trade imbalance. Then let's take a look next at the 6 Southeast Asian nations that are among the hardest hit by Trump in the entire world. They have tariffs between 32% and 49%. If imposed, these tariffs could have a devastating impact on the manufacturing sectors in these countries, especially Vietnam and to a slightly lower extent, Thailand. That's because these two countries are heavy exporters to the United States. They've benefited from the so-called China Plus One strategy. That's when manufacturers who were producing a lot of goods in China decided they wanted to try to avoid the tariffs in China and move some of their Chinese manufacturing to nearby countries. Well, guess what? The tariffs have followed them there, so that's not going to work anymore. Finally, Yuka, let's look at India. So 27% for India. That's higher than India expected its own rate to be. That is likely to push Prime Minister Narendra Modi to speed up trade talks with the United States. But as we've seen, 27%, that's actually lower than a lot of other countries in the region. And so if these tariffs stay in place long enough, where companies relocate their manufacturing, India could actually position itself as a winner here. They could say, look, we're a more attractive place to produce goods, and could set themselves up to win in this new era of the global supply chain.
Well, Charlie James, thanks for all that. Now, in announcing the new tariffs, Donald Trump declared that foreign trade and economic practices had created a national emergency for the United States and that he was taking action to restore America's competitiveness and bring manufacturing back home. Now, for more on what he's aiming to achieve here and what it will mean for global and Asian trade, let's bring in Jean-François de Meglio, president of the Asia Center here in France. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, during his first term, Donald Trump targeted China in particular, which led to this, as we heard from Charlie now, this China plus one supply chain strategy to diversify manufacturing operations outside China's borders to mitigate risks. But now he's hitting those other Asian nations hard. What is he trying to do here?
Well, what you said is very correct. But I liked most the word which has been just pronounced, which is reset the organization of world trade. I think we have to step back a little bit. What has been mentioned is factual. There is no question about Trump's decision to hike the tariff rates on several countries in Asia, Northeast Asia, and of course, Southeast Asia. Well, that has been announced. Now we still have to see how this is applied. One thing which has been mentioned is very important is the bargaining side of this announcement. Trump is trying to achieve several things and probably kill several birds with one stone. One, of course, bargaining with some countries like South Korea, Japan, which are real allies in the setup of defense system for the United States in the region. What does he need those countries to do? He needs them to hike their defense budget and buy more American equipment. So the bargaining tool here is the tariffs, and with the tariffs, he hopes that they will be forced to hike their defense budget and buy more American goods. That's one. Second, yes, Southeast Asia indeed. Southeast Asia has been at the core of the China plus one strategy, and it succeeded. But China plus one strategy is not only a Chinese strategy to avoid tariffs against China, it's also a strategy by Western, including American corporates, to delocalize and avoid the problems they might have in China, not only the US tariff problems, but also the growing difficulty of doing business in China. So it's hitting those countries, of course, but it's also hitting his own corporates and the Western corporates all at once.
Jean-François de Meglio, thank you for that. But stay with us a little bit longer because we're going to look at one country in particular, Vietnam, the nation of 100 million, has emerged in recent years as one of the fastest growing economies in the region and a magnet for foreign investment. But its large trade surplus with the United States has made it a major target of Donald Trump's tariff salvo. Jennifer Bin-Bryan tells us more.
Confusion and uncertainty in Hanoi after US President Donald Trump announced a raft of punishing tariffs on friends and foes. Vietnam is near the top of Washington's so-called naughty list, with a hefty 46% duty on its exports to the US. It's all anyone can talk about at this trade fair.
Most of my company's clients are in Japan, and most of the clients are selling to the US, so they will definitely be affected.
A severe blow to Vietnam. The US is its largest export market, making up a third of the country's GDP. Its powerhouse manufacturing industry is the most at risk. The US imported more than $15 billion in textiles and garments from Vietnam last year. American brand Nike produces half of its footwear in Vietnam, and according to UBS analysts, customers could see a price hike of between 10 to 12%.
This is a very high tariff, and it will have a huge impact on Vietnamese exporters to the US, including the textile industry. I believe companies must immediately begin to change their policies to adapt to this. One of the solutions is to shift towards other markets, such as Europe.
Washington says these tariffs are a way of countering Vietnam's trade surplus. In 2024, the country ranked third when it came to the largest trade imbalance with the US. This despite the Vietnamese government in recent weeks trying to do damage control ahead of a tariff announcement by boosting US imports. Vietnam is Southeast Asia's fastest growing economy and a hub for Chinese companies, hoping to avoid US tariffs back home. Gold prices hit a record high following Trump's announcement. But this did not stop Hanoi residents from lining up to invest in gold, a sign of fear that the country's economic growth could lose steam.
Well, Jean-François de Meglio, as we've seen in the case of Vietnam, there's a lot of anxiety about just how much economic pain those tariffs could inflict on people and businesses, especially in developing economies, not just Vietnam, but also Thailand and Cambodia. They're not like China. Could those smaller powers then retaliate with their own tariffs?
Well, of course, there's a tremendous asymmetry between what those countries can do and what the US can do. The early retaliation, it's not a retaliation, that we have to underline is the fact that the region by itself is integrating more and more. You have a trade agreement which is called RCEP, Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership, which was started in 2022. And you have a number of countries which represent about 40% of world GDP. India is out of this treaty, but now the trade within RCEP is growing by the year. And what can be the consequence of Trump's measures could be a better integration of the region itself.
Better integration of the region itself, but could those Asian countries then look for closer ties with Europe, for example?
Well, Europe is another story because Europe, of course, is complementary in some ways to those countries, but we also have our own trade problems with China, of course, and with some countries. Currently, there is an inquiry by the European Commission on electric vehicles, and we have to find a new path to negotiate with Asian countries. That could be in the interest of Europe if at least we cherry pick the sectors and the items on which we can cooperate, and conversely, the items and sectors on which we are definitely competitors, and we cannot totally be open to what Asia can offer us.
A complicated picture awaits as well. Jean-François de Meglio, from the president of the Asia Center, thank you so much for your analysis.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of Access Asia. But remember, you can catch up with this and all our previous episodes on our website and YouTube channel or on your favorite podcast platform. See you next time.